Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stan Orchowski, and I am the Research Director for the Justice Research and Statistics Association, and it's my pleasure to welcome you this afternoon to our webinar, Developmental Estimates of Subnational Crime Rates on the National Crime Victimization Survey, based on the National Crime Victimization Survey, with Lynn Langton and Bob Fay. We are all here in snowy DC, and we're glad you can join us. Before we go any further, I want to thank our friends at the Bureau of Justice Statistics for helping to make this webinar possible. Before we get started, I just want to cover a couple of logistical items. We will be recording today's session for future playback. The link to the recording will be posted on JRSA's website and emailed to attendees. Today's webinar is being audiocast via both the speakers on your computer and teleconference. If you have speakers on your computer or headphones and are not a presenter, we would recommend you listening to the webinar using your computer speakers or headphones. To access the audio conference, select Audio from the top menu bar and then select Audio Conference. Once the audio conference window appears, you can view the teleconference call-in information or join the audio conference via your computer. If you have questions for the presenters or would like to communicate with JRSA staff, we encourage you to submit them using the chat feature on the right side of your screen. Please select Host from the drop-down menu next to the text box, and you can send those questions in anytime you like. The session is scheduled for an hour and a half today, and so we should end promptly at 3:30 Eastern, if not earlier. If you have technical difficulties or get disconnected during the session, you can reconnect to the session using the same link that you used to join initially. You can also call WebEx Tech Support at 1-866-229-3239. In the last 5 minutes of today's webinar, we will ask you to complete a short survey. The information you provide will help us to plan and improve future webinars and meet our reporting requirements. All right, so there is a small but enthusiastic group of us who have been waiting with bated breath for this moment to learn about the subnational estimates that have been based on the NCVS that have been released by BJS. We've been hearing that this is coming for a long time, and we're very excited to finally see those happening. And all of those of you who are out there in the States should be very excited as well. And by the end of today, you'll know why you should be excited. So I'm going to turn this over to our presenters. Let me tell you a little bit about them first. Our first presenter is Dr. Lynn Langton, who's the Senior Statistician in the Victimization Unit at U.S. Department of Justice, Bureau of Justice Statistics. Dr. Langton has published nearly 20 reports based on data from the National Crime Victimization Survey on topics ranging from hate crime to sexual victimization, identity theft, and interactions between the police and the public. She oversees BJS's National Victimization Statistical Support Program, used to enhance the NCVS Methodological Research Program and assist in the development of the NCVS Subnational Estimation Program. She's also heavily involved in the current NCVS Instrument Redesign Project and the day-to-day operations of the NCVS. And she got her doctorate in Criminology, Law, and Society from the University of Florida. But she's okay anyway. Dr. Fay is the Senior Scientist and Senior Statistical Fellow at Westat, where he has worked since 2008. Bob is also a research professor in the Joint Program for Survey Methodology at the University of Maryland. Previously, he worked at the U.S. Census Bureau, where he held the position of Senior Mathematical Statistician since 1990. Over his career, he has worked in several areas of survey design, estimation, and analysis, and he received his PhD from the University of Chicago, about which I have no jokes at all. So with that, we will thank both of our presenters for being here, and we'll turn it over to Lynn.
All right, thank you for that introduction, Stan, despite the jabs. We have quite a bit of material to cover today about the NCVS Subnational Program in general, and then more specifically about the recent R&D report released by BJS and authored by Dr. Fay and his colleague that presents victimization rates for all 50 states, D.C., and other select counties and metropolitan statistical areas. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and jump in. outline of this presentation to give you a roadmap of where we're going. I'll start by giving a brief background on the National Crime Victimization Survey, for those who aren't familiar. Then I'll talk about the development of the NCVS Subnational program, about the utility of having state and local NCVS estimates, and about the different approaches that BJS is taking to generate these estimates, including the approach that Dr. Fay is going to talk about in more detail, the development of model-based or small area estimates. I'll turn it over to him to talk more about how his work first started, his methodology, and then some of the key findings that are presented in the new report. And we'll wrap it all up by talking about how these developmental estimates can be used, where you can find the report, and where you can find the data tables to conduct your own analyses. Okay, so the NCVS is an omnibus crime survey, meaning it collects data on a wide range of violent and property crimes. These are all non-fatal crimes since the data are collected through interviews. The survey provides annual counts and rates of victimization and is used to measure changes in the crime rate from one year to the next and then over a more extended period of time. It was created back in the 1970s in response to the understanding that many crimes go unreported to the police. And therefore, we have this, what we call the dark figure of crime. So beyond collecting data on crimes both reported and not reported to the police, another benefit of the NCVS design is that it involves a standardized interview and data collection protocol nationwide. This is in contrast to what we have with official crime statistics, where you may have variations in statute from one place to the next, and then on a national level, variations in what and how often local police departments report to the FBI's UCR. Also, the NCVS is an incident and attribute-based collection. It's incident-based in that we collect information on the characteristics of up to 6 victimizations during the reference period. So we have data on the nature of and responses to specific incidents of crime. And it's attribute-based in that we generally don't ask respondents, for example, whether they were robbed, because we know that these terms are tough, and someone may have had their house broken into, but they say they were robbed rather than burgled. So instead, we ask them to tell us about the incident, and then based on the attributes they provide, we classify the type of crime as a robbery or a burglary. NCVS data are collected for BJS by the U.S. Census Bureau. The Census Bureau selects a nationally representative sample of households and then sends field representatives out to interview all persons ages 12 or older in the sampled households. The interviews are conducted with the same household every 6 months over a 3.5-year period for a total of 7 interviews. The first is typically conducted in person, and subsequent interviews are conducted over the phone. And we enjoy very high response rates in the 80 to 90% range, which anyone in survey research can appreciate. But the key takeaway from this slide is really that the NCVS was designed to generate national estimates of victimization based on a nationally representative sample. Now, in the past 5 years or so, BJS has been looking to expand the NCVS. From being able to generate only national estimates of victimization to being able to produce subnational, so state and local, estimates of crime. We see a lot of value in having subnational victimization estimates. For one, the NCVS can go beyond police statistics and begin to get at the dark figure of crime. And this gives a better sense of who's at risk for victimization, what crime problems exist that may not be coming to the attention of the police, and so on. These estimates also have a lot of utility for resource allocation. Within the DOJ, for instance, we have grant programs, JAG, the Justice Assistance Grant being one, for which funding is initially allocated to states based on UCR crime data. So you could have 2 states with similar reported rates of crime that then get similar amounts of funding. But the problem is that one has a much higher rate of reported crime, unreported crime, and potentially that state really needs more resources than the other state. Subnational estimates can also be used to examine local crime policies and local interventions. Again, the NCVS is a standardized instrument and data collection process, so this allows for the comparison of places, be it cities or states, to see how they differ and how these differences contribute to differences in crime rates. Also, if you have a baseline measure of crime in a particular area and then a new policy or program is implemented, because you have a standardized measure, you can isolate the effect of that program or policy on changes in crime rates over time. And then finally, another value of the subnational victimization estimates is that NCVS data at the local level can be linked up with other local level sources of data on economic and social characteristics, on local law enforcement resources and policies, on victim service provision within the area, and of course, official police statistics. And this allows for the development of a much richer understanding of the criminal justice system within that area, as well as gaps and shortcomings in the functioning of the system. So there's a lot of justification for producing subnational NCVS estimates. Why don't we just do it? Well, of course, it's never that easy. Because the NCVS sample is selected to be nationally representative, it's not necessarily representative of particular states or counties. So in New York, for example, we may have lots of sample in New York City, but no sample in upstate New York. And the composition of people living in upstate New York may be very different from the composition of people in Manhattan. Additionally, we may have a lot of sample in New York State, but then we have no sample or very little sample in other states. So consequently, we can't say much about subnational rates of crime with the current NCVS design. So BJS is taking a multi-pronged approach to developing a subnational estimation program. I'll talk in a bit more detail about the first two approaches, direct estimation and the low-cost companion study, and then I'll turn it over to Dr. Fay to talk about the recent batch of estimates he generated using the last approach. So the first approach to generating subnational NCVS estimates is to boost and reallocate the core sample so that we have enough sample in particular areas to generate reliable estimates, and that sample is distributed such that those estimates are representative of the population of that area. So we're literally just adding enough sample cases so that we have the right locations to be able to generate direct state or MSA level estimates from the survey. And this is being done in large states where we already have quite a bit of sample to begin with. The advantages of this approach, in theory, we have all the variables from the core NCVS and the supplements available at the state level in states that receive the boost. Now, I say in theory, and I'll get into that in a second. Another advantage is that the estimates are based on direct survey data, so they're easy to understand and relatively easy to replicate. And because we have the full content of the NCVS available at the subnational level, BJS can provide state and local estimates that are not currently available through official statistics. So, for example, we collect data on victim-offender relationship, and this allows us to put out direct state-level estimates of intimate partner violence, which is something that you can't get through the UCR. Data on the proportion of crimes reported to the police is another big one, another big advantage. In terms of limitations, cost is a big one here. Boosting the sample isn't cheap, especially since a lot of where we've boosted is in fairly rural areas, and the interviewers have to drive further to conduct the interviews, and we also may not be able to share interviewers with other major federal surveys if those surveys aren't in those same areas as well. At this point, we think that for most states and MSAs where we're boosting, we'll need about 3 years of data to be able to generate estimates of violent crime with relative standard errors around 10%. So if something were to happen with BJS funding 2 years in, that could also have implications for the ability to generate direct estimates. And then another limitation with direct estimates is that we have to be concerned with disclosure. So we would likely not put out a public use data file with state identifiers. These files would be restricted use, where researchers would have to go to the Census Bureau, research data centers, present a proposal to conduct statistical work using the data, and basically swear on their firstborn child that they'll maintain the confidentiality of the data. And then one other limitation that isn't shown here is that with the direct boost, we're not able to go back in time to examine trends and changes over time. So any trend analyses based on the direct boost estimates will essentially start with 2013. So in July of 2013, BJS and the Census Bureau began a pilot test of boosting the sample in the 11 largest states. And with this pilot boost, we are able to test assumptions about cost, data quality, design effects, field operations, variability in victimization rates, relative standard errors, and so on. The pilot test lasted for 2.5 years and just ended at the end of December, and we hope to have a report on the findings from that by the end of this year. But in the meantime, we've been assessing the data as we go and making necessary adjustments. And then beginning in January, we began implementing the boost on a full scale in the 22 states that you see highlighted in this map. And these 22 states make up about 80% of the population of the U.S. and also of the crime. Now, in addition to the pilot boost and now the implementation of the 22 state boosts to collect direct estimates, another approach that we're taking to generate subnational estimates is a low-cost companion survey. This is separate from the core NCVS, and it's administered in particular areas to produce local area estimates that are comparable to the NCVS. So basically, it's a self-administered mailed survey that collects information on victimization, but then also on perceptions of and satisfaction with the police, perceptions of neighborhood safety, and other questions along these lines about disorder and fear that we're calling non-crime questions. The companion survey approach was piloted in 2014, and originally the idea was to try to blend the estimates with the core NCVS. But because of how complex the NCVS is, that proved to be virtually impossible. So the emphasis shifted to focusing on a survey that would parallel the NCVS and could be administered in multiple locations and over time to compare differences, say, pre and post a certain treatment in one area. In phase 2, a field test is being conducted using 2 different versions of this self-administered mail survey. The first is a simpler survey that can be used to generate prevalence estimates, while the other is more complex and is intended to capture incident-level information. The field test is being administered both in 2015 and 2016 in 40 of the largest MSAs, and part of the focus is on whether we can use this approach to detect changes over time. So can we pick up changes in the crime rate from 2015 to 2016 in these areas? And then also, can we detect differences in victimization across place? And another key feature that's being tested is the feasibility of generating sub-city level estimates. So the ability to look at within city differences. So in 3 of the MSAs, Chicago, LA, and Philly, we oversampled and we stratified the sample across police districts to see whether we can compare victimization rates and measures of police legitimacy across these areas. So wave 1 of the field test just wrapped up at the end of December with a response rate around 45% overall. So pretty good for a mailed survey. And we're doing some analysis of the data now, and wave 2 will go out later this year. So that covers 2 of the 3 approaches. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Fay to talk about the 3rd approach to generating subnational estimates.
Thank you. So The third approach is more labor-intensive and less capital-intensive. To set the history here, in 2008, a panel of the National Academy of Sciences recommended to BJS that they consider, among other improvements to the NCVS, development of small area estimates. Now, many of you may not have encountered this sort of estimation before. I'll describe it as a methodology that's different from the direct estimates that have been the bread and butter of the NCVS. In the first phase, there was work done actually at Westat doing a broad review of small area estimation possibilities. My colleagues Cantor, Krensky, Stuckel, and Rizzo submitted a report, and that's available on the BJS website. But I'm going to speak about the second phase, which was not just conceptual, but to actually produce the estimates we're going to show you. And under a grant to me and to my colleague Mamadou Diallo, we developed the estimates I'm going to talk about. Most of our research focused on states, but near the end of the project we were able to produce 4 large counties and large metropolitan areas. So Dr. Langton has already mentioned the constraints of working at the Census Bureau. This work was carried at the Census Bureau itself and used the internal files with the geographic information, where both had special sworn status, and then any numerical results we wanted to take out of the Census Bureau, we submitted and were approved by the Census Bureau Disclosure Review Board. We started really the work just in August 2011, and over a period of time I've been reporting progress papers at proceedings. The first was at the Federal Committee on Statistical Methodology in that January in 2012. Now, over the course of the project, we really enjoyed collaboration with the BJS staff to get directions, to appreciate what might be needed or most valuable. And so there had been a process of showing Disclosure Review Board approved results to BJS in a preliminary way before we've come out with this final set. Among the collaborations, I've mentioned that one of the papers, Dr. Michael Planty of BJS was one of our collaborators, a paper we gave in 2013. So where we got to is a technical report that's now come out, and I give the link here. You've already seen the title. The web page also has both this links to the report and also a link to Excel spreadsheets with the complete set of estimates that we produced. We have documented our methods besides these papers directed at a statistical audience. The methods are embedded in the software, which some of which is publicly available through the through R, and then others to BJS. So I'm going to talk about what we tried to estimate. One of the things about small area estimates is that they're only produced for certain characteristics as opposed to being able to cross-classify and dig into data. So the characteristics I'm going to show you are both violent crime by type, and one of the, just again to stress limitations of the approach, to get this much geographic detail, we were forced to combine rape and sexual assault with aggravated assault, not because they're equivalent, but only because the first category of crime was so rare we couldn't even model it. As reported in NCVS, I should add. But the NCVS reports were too thin to produce a state-level model. Robbery is another category, and the NCVS measures simple assault. That's the largest single source of violent crime in NCVS, and that was the other component we modeled. We could also break down violent crime by relationship to the perpetrator. This was a second goal that was added during the course of the project. So intimate partner violence has been a key interest of the research community, and there are some reports by BJS nationally about this type of violence. Secondly, we separated out violence committed by strangers, one or more strangers, and then had to group together all other types of crime that could both be other relatives, friends, acquaintances, and a small category of unknown. The other characteristic we estimated was property crime, and that broken down by type. These three types are burglary, larceny, any type of theft except motor vehicle theft as a third category. Motor vehicle theft was somewhat thin and hard to model. Property crime in total, however, is much more frequently reported in NCVS than is violent crime. So it was an easier problem, but perhaps the less interesting one. Additionally, what we did is to try to provide, or are providing, estimates for 50 states and the District of Columbia, 65 large counties, and for 51 large metropolitan areas, or CBSAs. And these are only the largest ones. We didn't dig down further. As you may listen to the talk, you'll maybe appreciate we weren't, by the time we got to counties and metropolitan areas, didn't want to model areas that we might not even have any sample in NCVS. The other thing is we're estimating for time periods here, so we've formed the estimates into 3-year averages, even though the model was originally developed for single years of age. But these 3-year averages that we show provide more stability, and it's the same strategy, unless it's been revised, that will be used for publishing estimates in the boosted states. At least I understand the 3-year averages will be offered there. Now, I think we've learned in the U.S. that users can or are willing to work with 3- and 5-year estimates, given the American Community Survey experience. So this notion of averaging is to stress we're looking more at longer-term trends than very short-term changes in the level of crime. For the estimates we've produced, we consider a window of 15 years worth of NCVS data and produce 13 sets of overlapping 3-year estimates. We were able to estimate states up to 2013, but because of availability, we cut off our estimation at 2012 for the county and metro models we've produced. So I'm going to give you 4 slides of sort of a crash course on small area estimates to say that the characteristics of the estimates we've produced are like, in some ways, other small area estimation projects that have occurred. Most surveys, and in NCVS, other federal surveys, practically all the products would produce estimates we call direct estimates. And typically, you can obtain the estimates by adding up weighted estimates on a data file or doing relatively simple operations to estimates that you have from the data file. The direct estimates for an area or domain use data from the domain only, so that estimates for New York State would depend only on data that were collected in New York. But as a consequence, the reliability of these estimates depends on how big the sample sizes are in the domain in question. Now, small area estimates, in contrast, and I'll just mention, as we did, even though I was building on other ideas, collaborated with a late colleague, Roger Harriott, in '79. A few years before then, produced these estimates, and then we published an article about applying these ideas to the 1970 census long-form data. And so that was a sort of large initial application. It was only for very small places where the long-form data would be unreliable. Now, there are several efforts going on producing specialized small area statistics in a number of federal surveys. And the characteristics of these, through models, use data from other domains or sometimes other time periods to form estimates. And so the estimate for New York will not, in an application, might depend on what's observed in other states as well as New York. And as a group, they all depend one way or another on some implicit or explicit statistical models, much more so than direct estimates. And the idea is to produce or improve the reliability of the estimates, but in a sense, because it's a model, it's maybe doing well on average, predict general patterns among the domains. Now, the key idea is also to incorporate auxiliary data from external sources. Without auxiliary data, the small areas estimates don't do too much. Now, but paradoxically, because especially if you have the auxiliary data, then you can even produce estimates through small area models for areas that don't have any sample at all or have very small sample. And very typically, you get much smoother estimates out of a small area model than the variability you will see with sample estimates based on moderate to small samples, where much of the variability is due simply to sampling error. Just to give you kind of a metaphor, this meant to be an informal term. Borrowing strength is used a lot, and it just says that these models borrow strength from other observations across the survey to make predictions for the domains of interest. There also, the term has been used indirect, and these models can either be for a single point in time and use information across domains to model. There are other models and applications that can look across time to help form the estimate. And you can combine both ideas and look across domains and time. And that's what the estimates we're presenting do. So that was general small area estimation, an overview. But what's specific about this application? Well, again, as I mentioned, we're using the geographic information on the Census Bureau's internal NCVS files. And we are able there, and behind the firewall, to compute the direct estimates for states or the other domains, but they're input to the model. And we're also used auxiliary data from the FBI Uniform Crime Reports by type of crime. Now, these are the most readily available statistics. They publish from this an annual series. The key statistics we use are enforceable rape, robbery, in terms of violent crime, then burglary, larceny, and motor vehicle theft as property crime. Now, we tried and found no gain, really, from including aggravated assault, which is a key component of the UCR's violent crime reports. But statistically, at an area level and trying different levels of analysis, found very little correlation between the two series. I'm speaking only as a statistician and mention this amongst subject matter experts to see if we could somehow figure out more about this. But moving along, I've already mentioned we're borrowing across domains and time. If you want the technical, or note the technical details, we produced a variant of the RAU-U model, which was published over 2 decades ago. Also, I can provide a citation to John Rao's book in 2003, or his collaboration with Isabel Molina, the second edition, Small Area Estimation, which is kind of the go-to book for statisticians in this field. So we've not wandered very far from standard methodology, but we tweaked it a little bit. Now, many of these the small area estimators, form a composite of predicting from a model such as a regression model, but also weighting in some amount of what the direct estimate is. In this case, for example, the estimate from New York for a 3-year period is coming both from what's observed in New York in other times, especially recent times, and through regression coefficients that are modeled based not only on New York, but all the other states, relating the UCR data to the sample estimates. So I'm going to show you some results for a while before I talked about their reliability, but these are some of the primary results, and I'm giving you, these are all coming out of the report I mentioned was available. I've just changed them from portrait to landscape, if I need to make that disclosure, but otherwise they're the same figures. I'm showing in blue, or used blue to indicate lower than average national, compared to the national crime rates, and red, a red scale to indicate elevated or above the national average. On the left, hard to see, but on the left are the estimates we've produced, these small area estimates by state, and on the right, in some contrast to what the UCR. Now remember, the two sources are measuring different things. The simple assault is being reflected in the estimates on the left, but not the right. And I don't want to make too many contrasts because there are multiple reasons for differences, but it is kind of striking. There's somewhat more crime showing up in the northwest states, especially Washington, Oregon, compared to the portrayal in the UCR. The South Atlantic states along the Atlantic, starting, well, Virginia is low in either series, but moving down the coast, there's a whole series of states estimated to be low, whereas the UCR gives us a different picture. And one thing I've noticed a long time ago is Tennessee, which is sometimes commented on as having a very high rate of violent crime in the UCR, does not show up that way at all in these estimates. So even though the model is using the UCR data, it's also using direct data from the NCVS averaged over time to form these estimates. Now let's see, this is just for the most recently available 3-year period. This is the picture for property crime, somewhat similar in terms of the contrast, especially both this higher crime in the Northwest than we might have thought from the UCR, and lower crime along the South Atlantic states. Now, also, I've shown in figures what happens if you average these small area estimates over a period of time, in contrast to, and that's the full 15-year period here, in contrast to what the UCR looks like over that full period. And the story is somewhat similar, a little different. And similarly for property crime, the shift a bit to the northwest, even and west in this picture compared to the South Atlantic states. Rape and aggravated assault, I'll show you some pictures now. Here again we're comparing NCVS on the left and UCR on the right. I'm only commenting what you can see. This again shows some differences with the South Atlantic states showing up in the Northwest. That's kind of one of the most persistent differences. Robbery. Now, I'll pause on robbery because with this model, the UCR and the NCVS were closest in alignment of all the violent crimes. So the regression coefficient on robbery was quite substantial, and the patterns look fairly similar. Still a little bit of difference in the East South Central states, or South Atlantic states. Simple assault. Now, I've changed, there's no longer UCR on the right. I've put two graphs up here, but the left is just the most recent period. On the right, you'll see what happens if we average these small area estimates over the entire period. So there's some contrast between the answers for both. It was only recently that Pennsylvania shows up as a high crime state with simple assault, and less so over a longer period of time. We tried our best, and here what shows up in terms of intimate partner violence and what the model predicts. Again, I'm predicting the recent period, showing the recent period on the left-hand side, the longer-term average on the right-hand side. I don't have, being only a statistician, I have an interpretation for what we're showing up here. The national estimates show that intimate partner violence is frequently of the type of assault, most frequently reported as some form of assault. But this is another feature of the small area estimates is there's too thin, the data are too thin to cross-classify. So we've told the story two ways. We've told it by type of crime, and here we can tell it by the perpetrator, but there are no estimates of the cross-classification by state. Here's violence by strangers. Again, there's no UCR data to show as a reference, and we get similar pictures over the short-term and the longer-term average. I wanted to show that we're also providing in the report all the graphs state by state. I'm picking on Massachusetts that's been shown before in a previous talk. And these graphs show a trend over time. So we take up, first of all, violent crime, and in the graph there is again a comparison to the UCR. Now, if I go to the UCR first, Massachusetts, this entire period has been a very average state with respect to violent crime. The model, because of an apparent dip in violent crime during the early 2000s, we see this portrayed as a dip, and simple assault seems to be the biggest contribution to that, but then the estimates come back together again. We can also offer violent crimes by the perpetrator. Now, this total crime in black is still the same values as in the preceding graph, but the type of crime here, you'll see that the intimate partner violence is the smallest of the three components in blue at the bottom. It's really quite average, and there's not too much to distinguish these graphs except the difference maybe seems to come out of maybe others more than, and possibly a little bit from stranger violence during that period where the estimates, small area estimates, seem to dip. Here's the results for property crime in Massachusetts. These are on page B64 of the report. You'll see the UCR really points to Massachusetts as having a much lower property crime rate than the nation as a whole, and especially due to theft or larceny. And actually, our small area estimates present a fairly similar picture. So in these cases, although I've other cases drawn a contrast between the UCR and NCVS small area estimates, in this case, you would say it's a fairly similar picture. Of course, we're seeing here the kind of drop in crime that showed up in the NCVS more so than the UCR during this early period of the 2000s and some years before that. Let me say a few words on what we did to evaluate these estimates. The first thing we did was a more empirical and I hope more intuitive kind of comparison I'm going to show you. This was very constrained by Disclosure Review Board requirements and my own concern not to ask too much. So what we did is to average, first of all, a preliminary version of the small area model over time and just for total violent crime and total property crime. But we also did the direct estimates by state and averaged them over 15 years. Now, by averaging survey estimates over that long a period of time and showing only rates, there was essentially very limited chance of any kind of disclosure. You could, the fact that crime occurs in every state tells us nothing about any individual. So probably, I maybe didn't push this as hard, but I can show you what I asked for. I do think the Disclosure Review Board generally would not allow publication of annual estimates from small states. The presumption is, and I assume this has already been asked, the boosted states, there'll be some things coming out, but as Dr. Langdon mentioned, probably not microdata files for public use. So this was a special request, and I approved, and I also drew a cutoff at 2 million. Again, just to be sure that the sample in a small state wouldn't cause a concern. So then I'll show you the same kind of picture we've been looking at, but I put first in gray all the states I've included. Now, in hindsight, maybe I could have gone down to 1 million, because I would tell you I worry even more about states below 1 million and their accuracy than below 2 million. But just to be safe, these are, the gray states are essentially unknown, although I could have shown you the averages, but I left them gray too to make the comparison, visual comparison, easier. Then I'm showing in the other states, I wanted to show you that very close agreement between taking an average of the NCVS over 15 years and what the model estimates did over 15 years. Now, this is kind of inherent in the modeling, too. The model is trying to use the sample data to the extent it can, and over a 15-year period, any place where the sample data is becoming reliable, it's being built into the estimate over time. So I hope this graph shows you that the estimates we're producing aren't made out of just whole cloth and totally dreamed up, but correspond to what the survey's been saying, and even our somewhat high estimates of crime in Washington and Oregon are matched equally or somewhat more so by the direct sample data. There's actually a table of these results in the report as well, if you want to look at the specific figures. So that's one evaluation. The other measure that's often or almost always now produced for small area estimation products is to produce the mean square error or its square root, the root mean square error. And the RMSEs are easier to show people and work with. So we produce those for all the estimates, and they're shown in all the spreadsheets. So we've looked at them in order to get an idea of how accurate these are. If I could tell you that these estimates are so accurate that the boosting is unnecessary, then I'd be proud as a statistician, but that's not the case at all. The estimates have more error than will be obtained from the direct estimates that will be obtained at the state level from the boosting, and by quite a lot, as opposed to maybe getting a 10% error in boosted states. We're seeing something closer to 20%, and yet we're still seeing some picture that's been hidden in the NCVS data, at least from public view. So we have these available. Now, we see, I'll comment as the statistician to the root mean square errors in the very smallest states are quite large. And with states below 1 million population, I can tell you even a statistician looking at the design from the outside with no privileged information could say it's virtually impossible that the current NCVS design could be in every state, because they only had national estimation objectives. And anyway, I could go through a long argument, but the short of it is you can almost be sure that some states aren't in the NCVS at all. And then those other states that are in with less than 1 million population don't have that much sample. So, and particularly for violent crime, but even for property crime in very small states, if you have sample, it might be in only one county, and it's representing other counties in a state. You can do that in New York State and take primary sampling units, but or California, or Texas. But in small states, that's really pushing the limits. So, but in between, I think these estimates, getting above 1 million, we can make some sense of them. And for at least a period of time, at least projected out, we won't even have boosted estimates for some time in many states, and even in the states about to be boosted, 11 states, these will be the best estimates we have for a little while. Now, and so I see this as one of, fitting into one of 3 overall goals, contributing and not taking away from the other efforts that BJS is doing to produce small area results. Looking from a distance, and with a disclaimer here, that's my own opinion, but it may be this method may provide useful in the future as BJS needs to integrate the low-cost companion survey and the 40 CBSAs and what the NCVS may be saying there, the core NCVS. So that might be something in the future, and it might help us to understand what are the differences between the low-cost survey that's going to be fielded in the core NCVS. So, and with that small look to the future, I'd like to turn it back to Dr. Langdon.
So before we turn to the Q&As, I just want to talk quickly about the utility of these SAE estimates and also where you can find the data. And, you know, Dr. Fay has touched on all of this already, so this is just a sort of a summary at the end here. So Dr. Fay put up the web location for the report, but for those who weren't able to quickly jot that down, if you go to the BJS website, www.bjs.gov, on the home screen, you'll actually see the report in the list of new releases. And if you click on that title, you'll go to a page that has an abstract, a link to the PDF file, and it also has a link that says Excel. And those Excel tables contain all of the data that Dr. Fay has discussed here and more. So for each state, you'll have estimates over time in those 3-year rolling periods for a range of violent and property crimes. There are also some point estimates, the numbers of crimes, and then also for select counties and CBSAs, you'll find that information as well. Now, again, these are developmental estimates, and you know, this methodology has been vetted, and as Dr. Fay talked about, he's gone through steps to verify and validate what he's done. But you know, the reality is we're still wrestling with how to disseminate all of these different types of subnational estimates that we're generating, and any new information that's added to the model, or if we pull in the data from the boosted states, this could change the estimate slightly, and so that's something to take into consideration. But even with that caveat, we think there's a lot of value to having these numbers and to getting a better understanding of where your state stands relative to the national averages, to the national average, and then relative to other states with similar characteristics. They have utility, these estimates have utility for examining differences in crime trends between states, beginning to try to understand why one state's crime rate may go up at a certain point in time while another's goes down. And as Dr. Fay mentioned, these are not particularly good. These estimates don't have a lot of utility for examining short-term changes over time. So, for example, the impact of a particular program or policy on crime rates. But we can go back over the long term and look at longer trends from the late 1990s and on. And then another use, as I mentioned earlier, is resource allocation, starting to think about whether if resource allocations for law enforcement and for other criminal justice entities were based on victimization rates that include the dark figure of crime rather than on official police statistics, what would that picture look like? And of course, you know, the one caution here that has also been mentioned is that because the UCR data figure heavily into the models themselves, it's difficult to really use these estimates to compare to rates of reported crime across states. But otherwise, you know, the data are there on the BJS website, and we would certainly encourage you to download them and to begin exploring what you can do with them. And here is the contact information for me and for Dr. Fay, and we can take some questions now, but then also, you know, feel free to email us if other questions come up after the fact.
Thank you. If you do have questions for our presenters, please email them in, chat them in to our chat line. Let me ask you a couple of things as a non-statistician. I guess my first question is, how do you look at other possible inputs to the models other than UCR? And it just seems like there would be like an infinite number of those, or a number of additional things that one could look at to model the NCVS estimates. So do you look at anything else? And
we early on we did look at a few other characteristics, not an extensive set, but one of them, a suggestion of a colleague of mine, was perhaps to look at murder rates in the, but that turned out not to contribute to what to modeling these characteristics we produced. That would have also been from the UCR, but the notion was maybe they would be less variable in terms of the standards and criteria. We looked at a very simple finding from just looking at the national tabulations is that simply dividing people into owners and renters, you get almost a factor of 2, not quite, on violent crime. Now, that's not controlling for other things, but so that seemed at a national level to be a clue, and yet putting that in the model, a proportion of renters, again, didn't do much for us or anything. We limited our data snooping in a sense to things that would make substantive sense, and there's some other work that was ongoing, because at one point I was also helping think through what characteristics would be good for modeling county crime rates. for use in the design of the NCVS, because the Census Bureau traditionally, every redesign has tried to fit a model modeling the relationship between the NCVS and other census characteristics that would be available. That didn't produce a very long list either. And again, even Renter did a little bit at the county level, but not very much. And interestingly, we went back, looking back through unpublished material, found the Census Bureau had no luck modeling using aggravated assault from the UCR as a predictor of violent crime in NCVS a decade previously. So that's about, I think during the course of the project I was looking for suggestions, and there may be someone can send me a suggestion, or send BJS a suggestion if the model is fitted again.
What about, BJS is paying for a lot of our members to do state-level victimization surveys, and a number of states have done these, and some states have done them every few years. How would that serve as an input, or how would those results be expected to, how would you expect those results to compare to these state-level estimates from NCVS?
I was just aware of, for example, came across a reference to Maine's recent release of their state level, and I don't know how, I think the questions to ask, the first questions I would ask are whether you get a uniform methodology across states, and can that be, the more uniform the methodology, the more easily it fits into some kind of compositing or small area model. The small area estimates kind of try to use the same just as NCVS is the primary input to the small area model, has the same questionnaire across the country. I think the matter would be how uniform the state results might be from one state to the next. And that can be affected not only by the questionnaire, but the mode of collection, response rate. It's kind of a tricky business sometimes to collect these data.
Mm-hmm. And you talked about, I'm just trying to conceptually, you talked about the root mean square error and the other measure, but if we know that both of these things are inaccurate in a sense. We know that they contain error, and we know pretty much at this point what the nature of that error is for both sources. So how do you know when you're sort of, how do you know if you've improved, I guess, would be my question, on, or is it not a matter of improving on what we've got? Is it a matter, I guess so, it's like, partly it's a question of how do you evaluate, how do you know if your estimate is better, and for those of you on the phone, I'm using air quotes on better, but also, ultimately, the purpose of doing these estimates, I think a lot of us assume that, at least for some of these offenses, like sexual assault, that we're going to get more accurate responses from a victimization survey because so many people don't want to report to the police. So how do you know if that has in fact happened? Does that make sense?
So I think you're getting at sort of the comparison between the different subnational estimates, using direct versus using like a model-based, and how do we assess which one is correct? Again, using the air quotes, is that along the lines of what you're getting at?
Yeah.
I mean, I think that we would say in general that the direct estimates are the gold standard, right? I mean, that's what we'd want to do if we could across the country and across all counties, but that's not feasible. And even with crimes like rape and sexual assault, for example, which are relatively rare, producing subnational estimates is a challenge because you have to be able to get a sufficient number of victims responding in those areas to be able to put out reliable estimates. So there may be situations in places in the NCVS where we have little or no sample, even for particular subgroups. That's, something that's still up for discussion, and for particular crime types too, where it may be that we actually need to rely on more of a model-based approach, or it's a matter of rolling up the data from the boost over an extended period of time to be able to get sufficient sample sizes to be able to produce reliable estimates. So then it's a balance of, do you want the estimate tomorrow, or can you wait 3 years to be able to get it? But this, the dissemination strategy and how to integrate and use these different estimates in concert is something that we're still working through, but I think there's a lot of value in each of them, and they're very complementary. I mean, again, for example, with the boost data, we're never going to be able to go back in time. So if we want to do that, we have to rely on something like what Bob's doing, or trying to use existing sample and reallocating it and doing things like that. So, I mean, it's a very good question, and these are still things that we're wrestling with. But like you said, there's error in all of these estimates, and I think, we assume that what we're getting through the boost is the gold standard, and we'll sort of assess everything based on that.
So you mentioned that was just completed.
The pilot test was just completed.
So you haven't had a chance to look at that?
No, we got the initial, we got a file based on 18 months of the data, and we started looking at that. But then we really wanted to get that 2.5 years. And even then, ideally, we think 3 years to get the CVs, the relative standard errors that we want. So we'll be putting out a report on that later on this year.
And how does then that help? Will that help the estimation? Well, in other words, will the estimation will you be able to take another iteration of that based on the boosted data, and then hopefully this will model that boosted data even more accurately? Right.
I mean, these are discussions that we're having, and then in addition to that, and I'll let you jump in, and one other thing to mention is that we're going through an extensive instrument redesign with the NCVS right now. And one of the things that we're considering adding in, like I talked about with the companion survey, are these non-crime questions. So getting at things like perceptions of the police, fear of crime, perceptions of safety in the neighborhood. And those types of variables, if they're collected in this systematic manner through the NCVS, could also potentially feed into a model.
Yes, and could I add, the boosting, just fitting this model, now that the model's developed and the software, Lynn is right, there would take tweaking to reflect the changes in, let's say, the variances and sampling variances and covariances, because the model uses one variance generalization now, but there needs to be a small change to reflect the increased sample size in these states due to the boosting. But when that work is done, and it's not a huge deal, I can say in advance that the model estimates that might come out would really look very similar because of the compositing to the boosted estimates themselves, because the boosted estimates in the boosted states will reach a level of reliability the model isn't. This weighting together of the sample estimate and the regression model would recognize this and make the outcome very similar to just what the boosted estimate is. But there's an indirect benefit. Well, first of all, to be able to see a retrospective historical series that's now anchored into a more definite boosted estimate. Just in terms of what we've seen today, I'd love to see Pennsylvania when that comes out. That's one of the original 11. To see if that was just a fluke that the violent crime rate went up there, particularly recently. So once that data are available, rerunning the model would kind of anchor the experience of Pennsylvania into what's more known for the most recent period.
I am still looking for our first question from our participants, and I'm not seeing one. So I guess we've covered everything there is to cover. We're going to go ahead and put up the poll. We would appreciate your participation. I don't know if you can answer this or not, but you did mention funding, and I think it's remarkable that you've managed to do this considering the amount of funding that BJS has had in recent years. What is the thinking about, you know, where this is going in the future, say the next 5 years? Are you pretty confident that you'll be able to, well, maybe even 3 years, can you be confident that you'll be able to pull off at least the boosted piece? And
well, we've gone up to 22 states, and the Census Bureau has also changed their sample design to make it more flexible, so that if we need to expand or contract the number of states that we're boosting in, we have the flexibility to do that now on a relatively short-term basis, where we wouldn't have been able to do that before. But I mean, yes, we've boosted in those 22 states with the long-term plan of this being, you know, the way forward. And you know, we have support from other federal agencies that are also, you know, very interested in having these estimates. There's a lot of value, for example, in terms of understanding, you know, the victimization from the perspective of, you know, the Office of Violence Against Women, the Office of Victims of Crime. So we have a lot of other support. And so, yes, I mean, we're thinking of this as a long-term program.
And have you had a chance to present this to anybody who does control the purse strings? That I mean, or is there just? I would think that there would be interest in this from Congress and at least this administration, and who knows about the next, but because of the potential to have such a rich source of data that we just have not been, you know, had in the past. Do you have any inklings that? Is somebody going to hand you a big old fat check?
You're asking me questions that are above my pay grade right now.
Well, we need a crystal ball, really, all of this.
Right.
All right. Well, thank you all very much for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Langton, Dr. Fay, for presenting this information. And the emails are up there. If you all apparently are too shy to ask your questions here today, if you'd like to email those folks, they're happy to answer your questions. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Have a great day, and look for our next JRSA webinar.
Thank you.